Montana Territory, October 1883. In the shadow of the Bitterroot Range, where autumn rain turns to sleet without warning, a peculiar structure began rising near Stevensville. Neighbors passing by slowed their wagons. Some squinted, others just shook their heads. What they saw made no sense. A man named Caleb Thornwood was building something that looked like a massive timber pavilion, a shelter you'd expect at county fair, not on a windswept homestead claim. 28 feet long, 18 feet wide, with a steeply pitched roof that seemed to swallow more lumber than most folks use for an entire cabin. And here's what really baffled them. He was building the shelter first. The cabin itself? That would come later. Inside, underneath. What in God's name is he thinking? Muttered Henry Gladwell, the settlement's most experienced carpenter, watching from the trail. Man's building a house inside a barn. But Caleb wasn't thinking about barns. He was thinking about fire, or rather, the lack of it. Because in that corner of Montana, you could have a winter's worth of firewood stacked 10 feet high and still freeze to death if you couldn't get it to burn. The problem wasn't quantity. It was water, rain that soaked in a split pine and never fully left. Snow that melted during the day, refroze at night, turned cordwood into ice log bricks. Autumn storms that drenched everything, followed by cold snaps that locked the moisture in. Your wood might look dry on the outside. Crack it open, and you'd find the heart still damp. Try to light it, and you'd get smoke, frustration, wasted kindling, and a cabin that stayed cold while your family shivered. Caleb had watched his first winter in Montana nearly kill him. Not from lack of fuel, from fuel he couldn't use. So now, in his second year, he was trying something different, something nobody else in the valley was doing, something that, to every practical eye watching, looked like the work of a man who'd lost his sense. They called it wasteful, called it backwards, called it proof that book learning didn't translate to frontier survival. They'd keep calling it that, right up until the first hard freeze. If you want to see how one foolish idea changed an entire region's approach to winter survival, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I promise you want to share this technique with someone in your area by the end. Caleb Thornwood wasn't a dreamer. He was a millwright's son from Pennsylvania, trained in timber frame construction, competent with an axe, and smart enough to know when something wasn't working. His first Montana winter had taught him that lesson the hard way. He'd done everything right, or so he thought. Arrived in late spring of 1882, filed his claim, felled enough lodgepole pine to build a tight 16 by 20 cabin before the snow came. By October, he had 4 cords of split wood stacked against the north wall under a canvas tarp, another 2 cords inside, and confidence that he'd survive until thaw. Then the rain started, not the gentle, predictable rains of Pennsylvania. This was different. Cold, slanting, relentless. It came in waves through September and October, soaking into everything. The tarp sagged, channeled water instead of shedding it. The wood beneath turned dark, heavy. When Caleb pulled a piece to burn, it felt like lifting a waterlogged fence post. He tried anyway, packed his firebox with kindling, coaxed a flame, added the damp wood. The fire hissed, sputtered, filled the cabin with ice-stinging smoke. The wood blackened on the outside, but wouldn't catch. He'd burned through half his kindling, just trying to get one wet log to sustain a flame. November brought the freeze. Temperatures dropped, but the wood didn't dry. It froze solid with all that moisture locked inside. Caleb would split a piece and see ice crystals glinting in the grain. Burning, it was like trying to burn a wet sponge wrapped in bark. His neighbors weren't faring much better. 2 homesteads over, a family named the Bishops had lost a child to pneumonia, sickness that might have been fought off in a warm cabin, but not in one that hovered barely above freezing because the firewood wouldn't sustain heat. Down in the valley, a trapper named Eugene Marsh had abandoned his claim entirely, packed up in January and headed back to Minnesota, muttering that Montana winters were a goddamn conspiracy of cold and wet. The problem was universal. You couldn't tarp your way out of it. Canvas ripped, sagged, funneled water. You couldn't stack wood inside. A cabin wasn't big enough to hold a winter's supply and still leave room for living. You couldn't rely on outbuildings. Most were just 3-sided sheds that let weather blow straight through. By February, Caleb was burning green wood out of desperation, choking on smoke, watching his fuel supply vanish twice as fast as it should because half of every log was water weight. He survived, barely. When the thaw finally came in late March, he stepped outside, looked at his remaining wood pile rotting into the mud, and made a decision. Next winter would be different. He'd figure out what the rain and snow were doing to his firewood, and he'd build his way around it. Not with tarps, not with sheds, with something that actually worked, even if it meant doing something nobody else would understand. Caleb spent the spring of 1883 studying the problem. He watched how water moved, how rain didn't just fall. It blew sideways, found cracks, seeped into stacks. How snow melted during sunny afternoons, then refroze at night, creating an ice shell over damp wood that trapped moisture instead of releasing it. How even a decent overhang couldn't stop wind-driven precipitation from soaking a wood pile. He noticed something else too. The few pieces of firewood that stayed genuinely dry were the ones stored in the rafters of his cabin. Not because they were warmer, but because air moved around them constantly. No condensation, no trapped moisture, just circulation. That's when the idea formed. He needed a roof, a real roof, not over the wood, over everything. Big enough to cover his entire living space and create a protected zone where wood could season properly, where air could flow but weather couldn't penetrate, where he could work, store, and live under one continuous shelter. In late May, he started building. The structure went up fast because Caleb knew timber framing. From massive corner posts sunk 3 feet into the ground, braced with crossbeams. Ridge beam running the length. Rafters every 30 inches, creating a steep 10 in 12 pitch that would shed snow and rain aggressively. The whole frame measured 28 feet long by 18 feet wide. Large enough to eventually enclose a cabin and still leave a generous covered area around it for its storage and workspace. He planked the roof tight with overlapping boards, then covered it with split cedar shakes. The eaves extended 4 feet past the posts on all sides, creating a deep overhang. Critically, he left the sides completely open. No walls, just posts and roof. What he built looked like a massive pavilion, a community gathering structure, a livestock shelter, anything but a home. Then, underneath that protective canopy, he began constructing his actual cabin. The technique was simple once you saw it. Build your weather protection first, then build your living space inside it. The cabin itself, 16 by 20 feet, log construction, tight chinked, went up in the center of the covered area, leaving 6 to 8 feet of sheltered space on all sides. That perimeter became his woodshed, his workshop, his covered porch. Wood stacked there would never see direct rain or snow. Air would circulate freely through the open sides, preventing condensation and rot. He could split wood in any weather without getting soaked. He could season green logs under cover. And in deep winter, when he needed to restock from his outdoor wood pile, he'd only carry it as far as the shelter's edge. After that, it was protected until it reached the firebox. The design had another advantage Caleb hadn't planned for: thermal buffering. That 6-foot gap between cabin wall and shelter edge created a dead air zone in winter. Not as warm as indoors, but significantly warmer than open ground. Wood store there wouldn't freeze as hard. Snow wouldn't accumulate. And the cabin itself, nestled inside the larger structure, had an extra layer of protection against wind. He completed the entire project by late August. Stood back and looked at it. It was the strangest-looking homestead in the Bitterroot Valley, maybe in all of Montana territory, and he knew exactly what people were going to say. The comments started before he'd even finished the roof. "Caleb, you building a church or a house?" That was Jacob Mills, a neighboring homesteader, riding past in July while Caleb was notching rafters. He said it with a grin, but the confusion was real. Why would anyone build a structure that big for one man? By August, when the cabin walls were going up inside the shelter, the jokes got sharper. Thornwood's got his house inside a barn. Man's living like livestock. That came from a group of ranch hands passing through town who'd seen the site from the trail. It spread. Within a week, half of Stevensville had heard about the backwards homestead where the barn came first and the cabin second. Henry Gladwell, the settlement's master carpenter, A man who'd built half the structures in the valley and had opinions about the other half didn't joke. He criticized. Caleb encountered him at the general store in early September, loading supplies. Henry looked him over, set down a sack of nails, and spoke loud enough for others to hear. "Thornwood, I've built in 4 territories, and I've never seen a more wasteful approach to a homestead. You've got more lumber in that roof than most men use for an entire house, barn, and corral combined. And for what? So you can keep your firewood dry." He shook his head. "Tarps cost $2. You've spent $200. Caleb kept his voice even. "Tarps rip. Sheds leak. I'm solving it properly." "You're solving a problem that doesn't exist," Henry replied. "Wetwood dries by the fire. Always has. That's what kindling's for. What you've built is a monument to overthinking." He picked up his nails. "Come February, when that fancy pavilion is crushed under 8 feet of snow, don't come asking to borrow my tools to rebuild." Others chimed in with their own assessments. "Looks like he's scared of weather. Real men just deal with it. Ain't natural, having a house tucked inside like that. Feels like hiding. But he's from back east. They do things soft back there." A freighter passing through called it the most expensive woodshed in 3 counties. The name stuck. For a while, that's what people called it. Not Thornwood's place, not the homestead, just the woodshed. Caleb didn't argue. He'd learned in his first winter that arguing about technique before results came in was pointless. Men respected what worked, not what sounded clever. So he finished his project, stacked his firewood in the covered perimeter, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. The rains came early that year. Mid-September, a week before equinox, a low-pressure system stalled over western Montana and dumped rain for 6 straight days. Not the gentle autumn drizzle that farmers prayed for. This was cold, wind-driven, relentless. The kind that found every gap in a roof, turned trails to rivers of mud, and soaked through wool coats like they were cheesecloth. Then it stopped. The skies cleared. Temperatures dropped 20 degrees in a single night. By the first week of October, the Bitterroot Valley was frozen hard, and everyone's firewood was soaked through. Caleb's neighbors tried everything they knew. The Ashfords, a family a mile south, dragged their wettest logs inside and stacked them near the hearth, hoping radiant heat would dry them out. Instead, their cabin filled with steam and smoke. The wood hissed, blackened, refused to catch. They burned through their entire supply of dry kindling in 3 days, just trying to coax flames from damp fuel. Jacob Mills, who joked about Caleb's church, had stacked his wood under a sloped lean-to on the north side of his cabin. Good design in theory, kept direct rain off. But the wind had blown moisture sideways, and now his entire supply was damp clear through to the heartwood. He tried splitting it smaller, hoping the increased surface area would help. It didn't. The moisture was too deep. Down in the settlement, people started burning greenwood, freshly cut cottonwood, and aspen, anything they could get an axe into. It produced more smoke than heat, filled cabins with creosote, and consumed twice as much fuel for half the warmth. Families huddled near struggling fires, children coughing, parents calculating how long their wood supply would last if every log burned half as efficiently as it should. Then the second storm hit. Late October. Another week of freezing rain, this time mixed with sleet. When it cleared, the temperature plummeted to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow followed, heavy wet clinging. It covered wood piles, melted during the brief afternoon sun, refroze overnight. Anyone who pulled a log from an outdoor stack found ice crystals glinting in the grain. Eugene Marsh, the trapper who'd left the previous winter, had returned to give Montana another try. He lasted until November 2nd, packed up his gear, abandoned his claim, and headed south, muttering that trying to heat a cabin with frozen wood was like trying to burn river stones. The Bishops, who'd lost a child the winter before, were struggling again. Their youngest daughter, not yet 5, developed a rattling cough that wouldn't clear. The cabin stayed cold because the fire wouldn't hold, and Bishop wrapped the girl in every blanket they owned and prayed the weather would break before the sickness worsened. Over at the general store, the owner, a man named Otis Farnham, started keeping track of kindling sales. By mid-November, he'd sold more in 6 weeks than he usually sold in an entire winter. People were burning through it desperately, trying to ignite wood that simply wouldn't cooperate. Henry Gladwell, the master carpenter, had his own problems. His workshop behind his house had a decent roof, but the sides were open. His stored lumber was soaked. He tried to work one afternoon, planing a board for a customer's cabinet, and the wood tore instead of cutting clean. Too much moisture. He threw the plane down in frustration and went inside to stoke his own struggling fire. Nobody was laughing at Caleb anymore. They weren't thinking about him at all. They were too busy trying to survive. If you're still watching, stay with me, because what happens next is going to show you exactly why this wasteful design became the most copied structure in the valley. The numbers don't lie. While his neighbors fought losing battles against frozen, waterlogged firewood, Caleb Thornwood was warm. Not just surviving, comfortable. Every morning, he'd wake to a cabin holding steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, even though the overnight fire had burned down to coals hours before. He'd step outside his cabin door, still under the protective canopy of his shelter, and walk 6 feet to his woodpile without ever touching snow or rain. The wood stack there was bone dry. Not surface dry. Not dry enough to try. Actually dry, all the way through. Light in the hand. Sharp crack when you split it. No hiss when it hit the flames. Just clean ignition and sustained heat. The difference came down to 3 factors Caleb had understood and his neighbors hadn't. First, direct protection. The overhanging roof kept rain and snow from ever touching his stored wood. That was obvious. But the second factor was what really mattered, continuous airflow. With all 4 sides of the shelter completely open, wind moved through constantly. No trapped humidity. No condensation forming on cold nights. The wood breathed. Moisture that did enter the grain could escape just as easily. Third factor, thermal buffering. The cabin itself, sitting in the center of the covered area, generated residual heat that radiated outward. Not much, maybe 10 to 15 degrees warmer in the sheltered perimeter than open ground. But that was enough. Wood stored there never froze solid the way exposed stacks did. Ice couldn't lock moisture into the grain. The wood stayed workable, splittable, and crucially, it stayed dry. Caleb tracked the difference carefully. He'd been a millwright's son. Measurement was habit. On a morning in mid-November, when the outside temperature hit 12 degrees Fahrenheit, he split open a piece from his covered stack and one from an exposed pile he'd left deliberately outside the shelter as a control. The protected wood showed no ice crystals, no dark moisture staining. The exposed piece glinted with frozen water throughout the grain. He estimated 30% moisture content by weight, maybe more. He burned both for comparison. The dry piece caught with 2 handfuls of kindling, established flame in under 3 minutes, and burned clean for 90 minutes, producing steady radiant heat. The frozen piece required 10 minutes of coaxing, a 1/4 pound of kindling, filled the cabin with smoke, and burned for maybe 40 minutes before collapsing into wet charcoal that smoldered uselessly. By Caleb's calculation, he was getting more than twice the usable heat per log compared to what his neighbors were experiencing. And because his fire burned efficiently, he was refueling half as often, every 6 to 8 hours instead of every 3. The math was brutal in its simplicity. If his neighbors needed 8 cords of wood to make it through winter, Caleb would need 4. Maybe less. But the most telling number wasn't consumption, it was comfort. On the coldest night in early December, when temperatures dropped to 6 below zero, Jacob Mills stopped by. He'd been hauling water from the creek and saw smoke rising from Caleb's chimney, thin, almost invisible, not the thick, choking plume that came from struggling fires. "Mind if I step in?" Jacob asked, stamping snow off his boots under the shelter's overhang. Caleb nodded him inside. Jacob stood for a moment, silent, feeling the heat. Then he glanced at the firebox. Small flame. Single log burning clean. He looked around the cabin. No extra layers of blankets. No one huddled close to the hearth. Just comfortable, even warmth. "What's it running?" Jacob asked quietly. 68 inside, Caleb said. "Been holding there since sunrise. I'll add another piece around noon." Jacob's cabin, he knew, was running 52 degrees on a good day. He was burning a log every 2 hours and still couldn't get warm. He walked back outside, looked at the covered woodpile, ran his hand over a split piece. Completely dry. He picked it up, light, almost hollow feeling compared to his own frozen fuel. How much did this whole setup cost you? Jacob asked. Caleb shrugged. In lumber? Maybe $200, counting the shakes and hardware, plus 3 weeks of labor. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then, how much kindling have you used this month? About 2 pounds. Jacob had burned through 40 pounds in the same period. He didn't say anything else, just nodded, thanked Caleb, and walked back to his own cold cabin. But Caleb saw him stop halfway home, turn around, and stare at the shelter for a long moment before continuing on. Word was about to spread, not through arguments or explanations, through numbers that couldn't be argued with. The shift started quietly, the way practical knowledge always does. It wasn't dramatic. No public apologies, no announcements. Just cold people noticing that one man wasn't cold and asking why. Jacob Mills was the first to ask directly. He came back 3 days after his initial visit, this time with a notebook and pencil. Walk me through it, he said. What you built and why. Caleb did. Explained the roof pitch, the overhang depth, the open sides for airflow, the positioning of the cabin to create sheltered perimeter space. Jacob took notes, asked about post depth, rafter spacing, how much the cedar shakes cost versus other roofing options. You planning to build one? Caleb asked. I'm planning to not freeze next winter, Jacob replied. 2 weeks later, and Bishop appeared. Her daughter had recovered from a cough, but barely. The cabin had stayed too cold for too long. She wanted to understand Caleb's setup before her husband started planning their next building season. She walked around the shelter slowly, studying it, picked up pieces of wood from the covered stack, hefted them, compared the weight to what she knew wet would felt like, stood under the overhang during a snow squall, and watched how the wind moved through without depositing moisture. Henry Gladwell said this was wasteful, she said finally. Henry's entitled to his opinion. Henry's been cold all winter, and said, I'll take wasteful over frozen. By January, the visits became regular. Men would stop by on the pretense of other business, borrowing a tool, asking about trail conditions, but always end up walking around the shelter, asking questions. How deep were the posts set? What thickness of planking for the roof? Did the open sides let too much cold in, or was the airflow worth it? Caleb answered everything. He had no reason to keep secrets. This wasn't proprietary technique. It was basic problem solving. Weather hits wood from above and the sides. Build a roof big enough to stop both. Keep air moving to prevent condensation. Simple. What surprised him was how quickly people started adapting the design to their own situations. Jacob Mills didn't build a full shelter. He couldn't afford the lumber. Instead, he extended his existing cabin's roof by 8 feet on 2 sides, creating deep overhangs with post supports. Stacked his wood underneath. Not as comprehensive as Caleb's design, but effective enough. By late January, Jacob reported his wood staying dry enough to burn clean, and his kindling consumption dropped by half. A rancher named Samuel Dorsey, who ran cattle 15 miles north, built a full timber frame shelter but made it larger, 35 feet long, 20 wide, and used it to cover his main ranch house, workshop, and with storage all in one structure. He called it the most practical building decision I've made in 20 years. Even Henry Gladwell changed his approach. He didn't apologize. Henry wasn't the apologizing type. But in early February, he started adding extended roof overhangs to every new structure he built. 4-foot eaves became standard in his carpentry work. And when a customer asked why, he'd say, keeps materials dry. Learned that the hard way last winter. The most telling moment came in late February, during a thaw. Caleb was in Stevensville picking up supplies when he overheard 2 men talking outside the general store. You hear about that shelter design Thornwood built? The one with the cabin inside. The backwards homestead? Yeah, I remember folks laughing about it. Ain't nobody laughing now. Mills copied it. The Bishops are planning one for next season. Dorsey's already got his up and running. Makes sense, I suppose. Can't burn what you can't dry. Exactly. Turn out Thornwood wasn't crazy. He was just thinking one winter ahead of everyone else. By the spring of 1884, the technique had a name, overhead sheltering. Not particularly creative, but functional. It described what it did. And it was spreading. Not because Caleb evangelized or sold plans or claimed credit. It spread because people were tired of being cold, tired of wasting fuel, tired of fighting problems that had simple architectural solutions. Within 2 winters, at least 14 homesteads and ranches within a 40-mile radius of Stevensville had incorporated some version of covered wood storage, either standalone structures, extended overhangs, or full shelter designs. Some were crude, some were elegant, but all of them shared the same core principle. Keep your fuel dry before you need to burn it, not after. The idea wasn't revolutionary. It was just correct. By 1886, 3 years after Caleb Thornwood completed his backwoods homestead, the architectural landscape of the Bitterroot Valley had quietly transformed. You could see it from the ridge trails. Homesteads that once featured simple log cabins with small outbuildings now sported larger timber frame structures. Shelters with steep-pitched roofs and open sides, built-in with storage under generous overhangs, covered work areas that protected materials and people from weather. The designs varied based on resources and need. Poorer homesteaders who couldn't afford a full pavilion structure would build extended eaves, 8 to 10-foot overhangs supported by posts, creating a covered perimeter around their cabins. Wealthier ranchers built massive multi-purpose shelters that covered living quarters, storage, workshops, and livestock areas all under one continuous roof. Some innovations improved on Caleb's original design. A Finnish immigrant named Michael Varshiainen, settling near Darby in 1885, built a variation with a partially enclosed south side. He left the north, east, and west open for airflow, but added a removable board wall on the south to block sun-driven moisture during spring melts. His wood seasoned even faster than Caleb's. A carpenter named Ruth Holloway, one of the few women practicing the trade in Montana Territory, started incorporating double-tier wood storage into her shelter designs. Bottom tier for seasoned, ready-to-burn fuel. Top tier for green wood that would dry over 6 months under cover. By the time you exhausted the bottom tier, the top tier had seasoned perfectly. Continuous rotation, no gaps in supply. The technique even spread beyond residential structures. The Stevensville sawmill, which had always struggled with wet lumber during autumn and spring, built a massive covered sorting and storage area in 1886. Lumber quality improved immediately. Fewer warp boards, less mold, faster turnaround from mill to sale. Henry Gladwell, who'd once called the design wasteful, became one of its primary advocates, though he'd never admit he'd been wrong. When customers hired him for new construction, he'd recommend overhead sheltering as standard practice. Keeps your fuel dry, your tools rust-free, and gives you workspace regardless of weather, he'd say, as if he'd invented the concept himself. I've been incorporating extended overhangs into my designs for years. Nobody corrected him. They just hired him to build their shelters. By the late 1880s, the practice had become so common in western Montana that newcomers arriving in the territory assumed it was traditional frontier architecture. They didn't know it had been considered foolish just 5 years earlier. A traveler passing through in 1889 wrote in his journal, "The homesteads here have a peculiar design, large protective shelters with the living quarters built inside or beneath. It seems to be the local style, well adapted to the wet autumns and harsh winters. Quite practical, really. Quite practical." That was the highest compliment frontier architecture ever received. Not beautiful, not impressive, not innovative. Just practical. It worked, so it spread. Caleb Thornwood, for his part, never claimed credit or sought recognition. He'd solved a problem that was making his life miserable. Other people noticed the solution and adopted it. That was the end of the story, as far as he was concerned. He lived in his shelter-protected cabin until 1904, when he sold his claim and moved to Missoula to be closer to his aging sister. The new owner, a rancher named Peter Kincaid, kept the structure intact and added onto it, extended the shelter another 10 feet to accommodate a larger workshop. When Kincaid eventually sold the property in 1919, the real estate listing described it as well-built homestead with traditional overhead shelter design, covered with storage and all-weather workspace. Traditional, 36 years after people called it the most wasteful idea in 3 counties. That's how good ideas become standard practice. Not through argument or persuasion, but through winters that prove who was right. The story of Caleb Thornwood's giant wooden gazebo is a reminder that frontier wisdom wasn't about toughness or endurance. It was about solving problems before they became crises. Modern survival culture often romanticizes hardship. We admire people who can start a fire in the rain, who can survive with minimal gear, who can push through miserable conditions. And those skills matter. But the pioneers who actually thrived weren't the ones who endured the most suffering. They were the ones who designed their lives to avoid unnecessary suffering in the first place. Caleb didn't build his shelter to prove a point. He built it because watching your family freeze while sitting next to a pile of useless frozen wood is a failure of planning, not a test of character. He looked at the problem, moisture-destroying fuel efficiency, and built an architectural solution that eliminated the problem entirely. The principle remains relevant today. Whether you're off-grid in Montana or managing a woodpile in Maine, the physics haven't changed. Wet wood burns poorly. Dry wood burns efficiently. A roof costs more upfront than a tarp, but it saves money, fuel, and frustration over decades. The broader lesson is this. Sometimes the backwards approach is actually thinking ahead, building the shelter before the house, spending more on protection than structure, prioritizing invisible benefits like airflow over visible features like square footage. These seem wasteful right up until the moment they're not. And when winter comes, numbers don't lie. 68 degrees versus 52. For cords consumed versus 8. 2 pounds of kindling versus 40. Those aren't opinions. They're measurements. They're proof. The people who mocked Caleb's design in 1883 weren't stupid. They were working with the assumptions they'd inherited. Tarps work fine. Sheds are good enough. Wetwood dries by the fire. Those assumptions were wrong, but nobody knew it until someone tested an alternative and tracked the results. That's how progress happens on the frontier and everywhere else. One person tries something different, endures the mockery, survives the winter, and quietly proves that the old way wasn't the only way. By the time everyone else adopts the technique, nobody remembers who thought of it first. It just becomes how things are done. And maybe that's fitting. Caleb Thornwood didn't build his shelter for legacy. He built it to stay warm. The fact that it changed how an entire region approached winter construction was just a side effect of solving his own problem well. So if you're watching this from somewhere cold, somewhere wet, somewhere that winters test your systems and expose your weaknesses, ask yourself, what's your version of the giant wooden gazebo? What wasteful investment would actually save you resources, time, and misery over the long term? Because the pioneers weren't tougher than us. They were just better at not making the same mistake twice. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what's the coldest, wettest winter you've ever faced. I want to hear your stories. And if this taught you something useful, hit that subscribe button. I've got more frontier techniques that worked when everything else failed. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.